We're going to finish this course today, maybe. We're going to finish this course today, maybe. All right, folks, we're getting started. So, the dimension of the divine that is present in our world is the dimension that we can have knowledge about. I.e., when we think about a personal relationship with God, that's the dimension of God that's present in our consciousness. The dimension of God that is transcendent, Soviv Kolam, the encompassing light of God. For that we have faith. You can only believe in something that you can't know. And he says that ultimately that will happen in the Messianic era, that we can have knowledge of this higher dimension. There are copies here, by the way, if anybody would like a copy. 32, thereabouts. We discussed at length last week that in the times of the first and second temple, the first temple there was false prophets, second temple baseless hatred. Both of these are the antithesis of faith, as we elaborated on last time. All right, we're going to continue on page 33. We'll jump right into the text. In the first temple, where there was a strong presence of the divine, such as the ark and its covering. So, important thing to remember is that whenever we have greater divine revelation, we always have greater challenge. It's always a tension, right? The negativity doesn't show up when things are parav or negative. Negative always shows up where there's holiness and goodness. So just as it was that in the first temple we had the ark and the covering of the ark, our tradition tells us that in the second temple there was no ark. There was a place of the ark, but there was no ark. So because there was this holiness of the ark, so therefore the forces of negativity were more present in the first temple, which challenged it by having these false prophets challenging the faith in God. And it says then, V'hanashim shayimavakis esatamuz, amru me'ez chadanu lekatem lechashmayim chasarnu. There was an idol called the Tammuz. If you look in footnote 57, the way they worshipped this idol was making it with a substance in its eyes that melted when heated. They would heat up the idol until it looked like it was crying, and then they say that it's crying for their offering. So that's a sidebar. Main point is, good morning, have a bagel. Good morning, have a bagel, and if you'd like a copy as well. So the women would worship this idol. Again, emphasizing the point that because there was greater holiness, there was a greater counterpart to it. 34, and so there were false prophets. What is a false prophet? A false prophet is one who says that God said something that he never said. So there was a certain type of intensity challenging the holiness in the first temple, because the first temple overall was a more holy environment. In the second temple, where there were 5 things missing, our sages say that if you look in footnote 59, there were certain things that were missing in the second temple. In general, if you're familiar with a little bit of the history, the second temple was not as beautiful as the first temple. Herod the Great came along and spent a lot of money and a lot of lives creating glory to the second temple. But even so, it paled in comparison to the first temple. So the first temple, which was holier, so the challenge was a greater challenge. The second temple, which was not as glorious, not as wondrous, was not as holy. So therefore, the challenge was not as strong. And the challenge then was not about um, challenging the faith in God, but it was simply hatred that one had towards each other. It was more in regards to material things. To believe the words of the gossipers, to hate each other. So what is baseless hatred? Baseless hatred is when somebody tells you something untrue about another person and you accept that. So in the second temple, where the holiness was not as great, so that the challenge was not as great as well. In the first temple, the challenge was about faith. In the second temple, the challenge was relationships between people. If people did not believe in these peddlers of gossip, people would not hate each other. He says something fascinating. It's against the nature of a person to hate another person without reason. If you knew that your friend never did anything wrong, why would you hate them? So the fact that people hate each other is simply because they believe in the falsity. Okay, but all that is to emphasize the point that we discussed in the last class, that when you have strong faith, when you have a strong presence of God, so we are equally challenged. The Rebbe would often write this in letters to people when they were experiencing challenge, to tell them that the fact that you experience challenge means that you have greater capacity, right? People who don't have great capacity don't get challenged the same way. So if you have a lot of challenge, it's probably a sign that you have greatness that needs to be manifest. So bringing it back to the point, when we have knowledge of God, when we have a more intimate connection with God, so therefore we have when we have a more intimate connection with God, we have knowledge of God. And when we have a more distant knowledge of God, or not no knowledge, just awareness of a transcendent dimension of the divine presence, that's where we have faith. Everybody gets that? Totally? Locked and loaded. Yeah, go ahead.
Part where you have faith if you see what you said.
So I think the simplest way to explain this is in the context of relationships. In general, in Hasidic philosophy, we do a lot of relationship conversation because we can really understand that. When you know someone well, you have a close relationship with them, the more you get to know them, the more we would say you know them. That's redundant, but that's the idea, right? When you look at nature, when you look at your life, our relationship with God is much more real because God is present. When we start talking about God as He is, a friend of mine gave a sermon on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. He said, everybody's concerned about Israel. He says, if you're concerned about Israel and you want to do something about Israel without any of the nonsense, you have to study more Torah and do more mitzvahs. That's the only thing that's going to save Israel. It's a radical statement, but it's true. But so, and I can elaborate on why it's true. But the point is that the reason why we don't actually buy that is because that's a distant concept. It's not close to us. If I tell you to, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but the very observant Jews, which more and more of them are joining the army, their position is that they don't need to join the army because they're doing the same thing for Israel as the soldiers are. And we're not going to debate that today because I got my own opinions about that. But the thinking mind says, what are you talking about? When you have terrorists coming to attack you, you need a gun. And they're not wrong. But the idea that a yeshiva student could sit in a yeshiva and study Torah and in so doing save Israel is foreign to us. Why? Because you're talking about something that requires faith. So when something requires faith, it's distant from us. We don't have a close relationship. We don't have knowledge. When I say I know something, it doesn't just mean I know it intellectually, I know it personally. It's real to me. When we talk about knowing God, we're not talking about a dimension of God that's transcendent. We're talking about a dimension of God that's immanent, that's present in our lives. So we have two commandments. One commandment is to know God, and one commandment is to believe in God. The commandment to know God is to invest effort in the things that are around us, the things that are within reach, to have that close relationship with God. The things that are distant from us, the dimensions of God that are distant from us, we have to have faith in. What the Alter Rebbe explained in this discourse is that the dimensions of God that are close to us are the dimensions of God that fills the world, fills the earth. If you want to use some Kabbalistic language, it's the name Elokim. The name Elokim, we're going to in a week and a half, we're going to begin the Torah again. It says, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'sartz. In the beginning, Elokim created the heavens and the earth. God created the earth using a filter so that the world can exist and God can exist. That filter is processed through the name Elokim. So we know enough if we invest ourselves to have a relationship with God. But yet there's a higher dimension of God that remains distant from us. And that higher dimension of God requires faith. Our job, our service, our work in this world is to try to bring a greater consciousness of the dimension of God that requires faith into the place of knowledge. That helpful?
And that's available to us through study and.
Through study, through mitzvahs, as we discussed earlier, that the mitzvahs become channels that channel down the higher dimension of God, and probably most importantly through prayer. The more we invest ourselves, again, we'll use relationships. When a young couple gets married, they are attracted to each other based on what they know. And what they know is enough to bring them together. But the early years of marriage are very challenging. Why? Because we're asking to have faith in the goodness of the other person, even though we don't know that. As we live life a little bit and we know more, we then build trust that the parts of the other person that we don't know, that we may never know, we trust that there's goodness there, and we move into a place of faith. So there's always a part of the other that you'll never know, but the faith in that part of that other person can become close enough, not that we would necessarily call it knowing, but enough that we can lean into that and have real faith in the other person. Ultimately, because we'll always be separate people, we'll never have a real knowledge of the essence of the other person. And that's what he's saying here as well, that in the Messianic era, we will get to know that dimension of God. Until then, the best we can do is get to know God as much as we can within the space of knowing. The more we know God in the space of knowing, the more we can experience the faith dimension of God. And that's most done through prayer. Prayer, meditation, contemplation. We spend time with God in the dimension of God that we can know, the more we can trust the higher dimensions of God as well. Good? A little better?
Better.
Okay. Yes.
So, what do you think about the fact that the prayers and the Hebrew letters actually have I guess, for the people, they have an energy about it. You look at it, you say it, and you just immerse yourself in it, that it can give you, it can like protect you, or something like give you a soulmates, or, like the Aris. I think they really related to that, like the Hebrew letters are just actually the things that created the world. That's what it's bound based upon. So I wonder what the Chabad philosophy thinks about some of the mystical aspects.
Well, I'll use the relationship example again. In relationships, there is, within the knowing dimension of the relationship, there's also the actions that we take. And when we are not in a place of knowing, but we show up with the actions, that itself keeps the connection in the relationship strong. Prayer has two dimensions to it. There's the intellectual dimension, which then translates into the emotional dimension. And then there's the action dimension of it. So just saying the words alone carries power. But if all you do is say words, you're missing out on the real point, which is to what's the content of the words? What's the energy in the words? Can I read? Can I connect with it? Can I contemplate it? Can I download it? Right? So both are necessary, but one is like a body without a soul. So letters have power, prayer has power, the words of prayer have power, but if all you do is say a bunch of words, so you're doing the action, but you're not getting to the real heart of the matter. Other questions? Yeah.
Greater challenge, the more capacity you potentially have. Can you elaborate more? Like, is the challenge the being open to faith or God, or is it more like suffering? What is that challenge that?
Yeah, suffering is, we don't have to, suffering is, what do they say? Pain is obligatory, suffering is optional. Let's use the word challenge, because suffering really is a choice. And actually the choice to choose whether one is suffering is, how do you look at the pain? Do you look at the pain as something that God is doing to you, or that God is doing for you? And the more challenge a person has is an indication that they have capacity to show up.
Feel like accepting or the letting go as opposed to like struggle.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. I spoke about this on Yom Kippur Eve, that I think that's the calling of our times, is not to fight with the challenge, but to realize the light that we have. In other words, when we face challenge, we get caught up in it. We get caught up in the struggle. Why me, and how, and we try to navigate to a place to realize, yes, the challenge is for me, but we have capacity to just lean into the soul and say, if I'm faced with this challenge, that means I have the power to navigate it. So I don't have to engage with the challenge. I have to just shine my light and navigate through it.
Like recognizing or believing in God or this higher power. Does that also show that maybe that person, even if you don't have belief, maybe you do have more capacity? Is that?
Yeah. So interesting. I'll from, the name Dennis Prager. Okay. So I can say this now because he's leaving soon, but he's been in Atlanta for the last couple of months, having treatment. And on Rosh Hashanah, I went to visit him. Second day Rosh Hashanah, my wife and I and our son-in-law, we went to blow shofar for him. And we had a very nice conversation with him. We spent about an hour with him. And one of the things that we spoke about is the concept of faith. He spends a lot of time discussing faith. So years ago, he wrote a book, and I mentioned this to him. He said it's still his most proud book. It was a book that he wrote with, why is my brain freezing? Rabbi. He wrote the book, The Rebbe. Anybody help me? My brain is fried a little bit right now.
You trying to remember his co-author?
Yeah.
It's a rabbi.
Yeah. Come on. Thank God for computers. Sorry? Telushkin, yes. Joseph Telushkin. So he writes in the book a beautiful line, which was really very powerful. Judaism, most other faiths, I would say all other faiths, require belief in God as a prerequisite for action. There's nowhere in the Torah it says that that you have to believe before you engage in action. And the reason for that is because the Torah believes that you have faith because you have a soul. And your soul knows the truth of God. Even if you on a human level are not conscious of that, you on a human level are not experiencing that, it doesn't mean it's not there. And in fact, one of the ways to get the faith going is by taking the action. Using, again, the analogy of the human experience, sometimes in a relationship, people say that it feels like the relationship is dead. And the reason why the relationship feels dead is because people have stopped taking the actions. And when you take the actions, it activates what's inside. We're entering into the holiday of joy, Sukkot. And one of the beautiful things about joy is that you may not be in a good mood, but if you start dancing, you start singing, you get into a good mood, right? You wake up in the morning, you're in the doldrums. Start singing. Put some music on, dance a little bit, and you'll find yourself in a good mood. Why? Because the joy is inside of you. It's just hiding in there. So the same thing is true in our relationship with God. Take the action, and then the spiritual connection will manifest after that. Yes.
One question, I hope it doesn't derail things, but
It's okay. We do it all the time.
yeah, talking about challenges here.
Yes.
And you mentioned false.
That's kind of how this works.
We
We
read about false prophets here, and I get this feeling today that we could be surrounded by false prophets in different ways. But I don't want to trust my feelings because feelings are easily manipulated. So is there a way to determine whom or what to be a false prophet besides them passing on prophetic messages that Hashem never said? Like, say, is there a governing authority similar to the Sanhedrin in the past that would?
Well, I'm the governing authority, and I will tell you today that TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook are false prophets. There's no governing authority, and I would say that the context of false prophets that we have today is, not the same as they were then. False prophets are our own need to get more in touch with God. We can always know what the right thing is if we lean into what's behind the facade. We live in a world of facades. That's the nature of the human condition, is that we don't see God. That's why we don't call it faith. We call it knowledge, because God is there, but he's behind the facade. It's our job to move through the facade, past the facade. And we do that through mitzvah observance, through Torah study, and through prayer. That allows for us to navigate that. So when we encounter these quote unquote false prophets, what we're doing is we're looking for, what does the Torah tell us? What is the guidance of the Torah? Where I would say we have false prophets today is the subtlety. It's the subtlety in the facade. The subtlety in the facade is very, very dangerous right now. More than ever before, in my opinion. We live in a world where everybody's wearing a hat of righteousness and argues that's why politics are so polarized today. Because if you speak to somebody on the right, they will tell you with absolute certainty and whatever it is that the people on the other side, on the left, are just evil. But they don't say there's another opinion, right? That would be honest to say, look, I have an opinion, you have an opinion. And you ask the people on the left, they'll tell you the people on the right are just evil, right? And they'll justify it with all kinds of moral arguments on either side. They'll argue the morality of their position. And our job is to navigate through that. And we as Jews have only the Torah to turn to say what is right and what is wrong, what is correct and what is not correct. And in that way, the challenge is even greater because we have to do the work ourselves to get there. And I think to the point that we've been discussing, that the more we're in touch with our own soul, the more we're in touch with the godliness within us, the more we're able to look at the facade and see it for what it is. Good? Okay. That was a lot, and we only had 29 minutes so far. Okay, let's go back into the discourse. Speaking about words, there's a saying from our rabbis that oisios machkimois, the letters make us wise. So sometimes when we get too far afield, we come back to the letters themselves are going to help ground us. So it says like this, middle of page 35. So this discourse is based on a verse, and you shall know today and place it to your heart, Ki Hashem hu Elokim b'shamayim imal v'al haaretz mitachas enoid, that God is Elokim, Hashem is Elokim, or in English, that the Lord is your God, in the heavens above and on the earth below, there is nothing else, right? So, Drew, right?
Yes, sir.
This is God's instruction to us. The Torah's instruction to us is, it is our job to know that it's God. By the way, a very important point is to recognize that even when we face these false prophets, that's also God. That's God talking to us. Not through the prophets, but because of the prophets. In other words, and this is also the point to challenge, when we face challenge, the challenge is coming from the facade. But that's God's way of saying to us, there's opportunity for you here. The opportunity may be to reject them, but that's your opportunity. And we have to navigate, am I being called to reject this, or am I being called to look deeper into it?
So is God inherently here leaving challenges to cause someone to use their own free will to go astray and possibly choose to come back closer to the Torah?
Sure. King David says, Shkios miyaven, who can comprehend the mistakes that we make? That even when we make a mistake, that itself is God leading us somewhere. When we make mistakes, that's God leading us somewhere, and it's our job to look at those mistakes not as something designed to crush us, but something designed to propel us forward. It's like when you go to the gym and you tear your muscle. I don't mean damage your muscle, but tear your muscle in the act of strengthening, right? It's not designed to hurt you. It's designed to make you stronger. So even when we make a mistake, even when we err, it's designed to help us navigate what was that inside of me. In fact, the greatest challenge that any one of us experiences, each of us have our own unique challenge in life. The greatest challenge is for us to be able to, that's where our purpose is. Our purpose is in our greatest challenge, in our greatest temptation. So instead of feeling crushed by it, we can shift the gear to say, oh, I'm experiencing this as my greatest challenge. This is where my greatest opportunity is. How can I use this to help me forward?
Something less balance for the false prophet, or the things that we fear is actually something we become.
Yes. Yeah. And if we're not afraid of that, and if we're not judgmental of ourselves, then we can look at that. Something I mentioned this over Yom Kippur. We're sitting in Jeff's place of recovery. If you've ever attended a 12-step meeting, it's a lot of fun. It's very enjoyable because the people that are in recovery are the most honest about their flaws. And it's humorous, right? When you can look at your own flaws without shame, it's laughable. Not laugh at, but it's laughable. Like, look at this human condition that we can be so nonsensical sometimes, right? But because we carry so much shame, we're unwilling to do that. And if we can move past the shame and say, oh, this is what I'm experiencing because that's where my opportunity is, then we're willing to look at that. And then we find where the light really is. You with me? Okay. Wow, this became heavy fast. All right. So what does it mean that you should know today and place it to your heart? Kfar nemar ata hareisa v'gomer kfar hareisa, because knowing God and feeling God, knowing God in a way that we can actually experience God. As we discussed, the dimension of God that fills the earth. We've already been told that God showed himself to us. At Mount Sinai, the verse says, Ata hareisa ladas, you have been shown to know. God showed himself to us. When you I made this point a lot over Yom Kippur because it was, I would say this was my work on Yom Kippur, is to get in touch for a moment with the soul. When you experience something, you can never unexperience it. When you experience something, you can never unexperience it. And you can always go back to that experience. The memory fades, but if you keep going back to that experience, it'll stay more present for you, right? So for example, if you've, anything from holding your newborn child in your hand to seeing the Grand Canyon, right? These are momentous experiences. And when you have that experience, tell me your name again, sir. Yes. Run race? Ramis. Ramis was sharing with us before the class about his experience coming from Cleveland to Atlanta. It happened 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago, but he remembers all the details. He remembers what he experienced going to the airport and landing in Atlanta, what he experienced when he came to Atlanta. It's 50 years ago, but it was an experience. And when you have an experience, when you see something, it becomes part of who you are. God showed himself to us, to each and every one of us, because all of our souls were present at Sinai. So it's inside of us. It's in the very essence, in the very DNA of our soul, is having seen God. Can never shake that. Now it's covered over by this facade, but it's there. So since it's there, it's within us. And therefore we can know, where did God reveal himself? In this physical earth, at Mount Sinai. So we can know that part of that dimension of God. That's why the verse says, Ata haresa, you've been shown ladas, to know. God showed himself to us at Mount Sinai, and therefore we are able to know that dimension of God. We can never unknow it. But that's the dimension of God that got manifest in our physical reality, in our world. But the dimension of God that's transcendent, that requires work. We can't naturally know that. Spiritually, naturally, that is. To know the dimension of God that transcends the world. That is, as the verse says, in the heavens above. The heavens here represents not the physical heavens, but the spiritual heavens. Shamayim bechinas sovev, heavens being that which encompasses us. To know that dimension of God, page 36. Shamayim sheim kadurim, like the heavens which are circular, that they encompass us, they're spherical. Ukumaya aretz shehi b'seicha shamayim, and like the earth which is within the spherical heavens. Vashamayim akifin la, and the heavens encompass it. So too the word of God that is in the dimension of filling the earth, is encompassed by the encompassing light of God, which has nothing outside of it. And by way of analogy, like the power of speech that is within the soul, within the power of the soul, before it becomes manifest and separated. So in each of our souls, we possess the power of speech. The way the speech is in the power of the soul, it is in an encompassing manner. Once we verbalize it, it becomes in the filled manner, becomes accessible. You can't know what's in the power of my soul until I speak it. When I speak it, you now know it. But when you see the knowing When you're able to know because you heard the words, you know that they came from somewhere. That's perhaps inaccessible, but there. So let's unpack this verse again. Go back for a second to page 35, middle of the page. The verse says, "And you shall know today and take to heart that Havaya is Elokim, on the heavens above and on the earth below, there is nothing else." Let's just see if he's going to explain this point, which is really important. Yeah, he's going to talk about this on page 40, the idea of these two names of God. We'll come to that soon. So our job is to know the dimension of God that transcends as we know the dimension of God that fills. Our work is to bring ourselves to a place where we can have a relationship with the transcendent dimension of God as we have a relationship with the immanent dimension of God. That's our work. V'yediyah zu, and this work is dafka hayoim, is specifically today. Today meaning in the present time, not in the Messianic era. Once the higher dimension of God is revealed, there's no work anymore. Then you have it. It's specifically when God is concealed that we have to work to bring ourselves to have a more intimate relationship with the higher dimension of God. Does that make sense? Everybody's very quiet.
What does Memle call Amin?
It means that God fills the earth,
What is Aviv?
encompasses. Let's read a little bit more in the text, and I think it'll slowly become clear. I am on 37, yeah. Middle of the page. The world to come receives from the dimension of God that fills the earth. Like a chain-like descent from one level to another level. Like a body that has a head, a hand, a leg. So too, there are many levels, the higher Garden of Eden and the lower Garden of Eden. In the world to come, not the world to come, so that when we say to come, it could mean in place, even spiritual space, or it can mean in time. So there's the world to come in time, which is the Messianic era, and there's a world to come in space, which is the afterlife. The afterlife is part of the created world. It's where God's presence is immanent, but we are without bodies. Before creation, there was God alone, only the transcendent dimension of God. When God created, he created spiritual consciousness and physical consciousness. The space of the Garden of Eden is a spiritual consciousness. Souls live there, angels live there. But the body, we leave the body in this physical earth. So we cannot do any work in that space. The only time we can do work is in this physical reality. The ability to choose between good and evil exists only when our soul is in the body. And therefore, the result of that is, which is not the main point here, but a side point, that it's a side point to make the point, which is that when we don't make good choices, we make it difficult for the soul to experience the godliness that's in the world to come, in the Garden of Eden. It's called dirty garments. We put on this kind of dirty facade that we adopt onto the soul that prevents us from experiencing the divine revelation in the world to come in the way we would prefer. Masha'enkin, go ahead.
Concept of St. Thomas, strip it up once, purify that.
So those that are living have the power to help those that have departed move through the levels in the world to come, but the soul itself can't. The only ability we have to choose is in this world. In the world to come, the souls are without, they have nothing to propel them forward. In this world, back to the whole challenge question, right? In this world, the challenge gives us an opportunity to move forward. The tension allows for us to push against it, to find the godliness that's within the world. That's our work in this world. But in the world to come, when we don't have a body, it's just the soul. There's no choosing. Every one of the 613 commandments has a physical manifestation through which it's observed. The obvious ones, putting a mezuzah, putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbos candles, keeping Shabbos, keeping kosher, and so on and so forth. But even the more ethereal ones, like faith in God, like loving God, like fearing God, those are things that we have to experience, God bless you, those are things that we have to experience within our physical body. And as we're emphasizing this discourse, we have the ability to do that through our efforts of contemplation and prayer and meditation. We have the ability to bring ourselves to a closeness to God, to a place of love for God, a place of awe of God. But once the soul leaves the body, it can't do any of that stuff anymore. So the Kaddish is recited to help the soul move through those levels. It also says that there are certain times during the year that God helps elevate the soul. On the holidays, on Shabbos, on Rosh Chodesh, the first of the month, God elevates the soul, but the soul can't do anything on its own. The soul becomes static. So,
and those levels you're talking about are moved through in the afterlife, right? Those are the 7 levels that we talked about last week.
well, there actually are myriads of levels. You're talking about divine revelation, it's infinite. So level after level after level. It's really beyond, I'm saying words, I don't know what I'm saying, because it's beyond our comprehension, right? The idea to move into a spiritual space where there's infinite levels is beyond our capacity to really understand. But we understand that there's infinite levels that our soul can experience. And what that means when we talk about infinite levels of our soul experiencing, it means a closeness to God, more and more divine light, more and more divine revelation. So, go ahead.
But there's still, maybe I was misunderstanding what was said. I thought there was something about 7 levels.
Say again?
The 7 steps of your soul. You start with the top and bottom.
5 levels of the soul. There are, our tradition tells us there are 7 heavens. And those are just another way of calculating, but it's not, they're not finite levels. They represent also the idea of different dimensions of divine consciousness. I guess too. I'm with you on that. Yes.
This could be wacky, but is there evidence to support that perhaps where the levels of the soul are maybe ascending towards the divine, that maybe we're born into the physical realm to be able to catapult us through lessons and stuff to higher levels once we actually.
Yeah. So it's brought down in Kabbalah. This is the whole concept of reincarnation, which also another topic that we're not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. But the concept of reincarnation is that there are dimensions of our soul. Somebody just gave me a great book, which I read half of it in one sitting yesterday. Give me a second. I'll tell you what it is. It's called The Lawyer and the Mystic. If you want to buy it, it's a small little book. It's called The Lawyer and the Mystic. I found it very, very interesting. It's a fictitious story of a fellow who's coming out of surgery, and he's waiting for a diagnosis, whether the cancer is metastasized or not, and he's reflecting on his relationship with the mystic, this mystic that he encountered, and it's very well done because it keeps you engaged, and the various different conversations that he had with this mystic, and the mystic touches on a lot of these core principles that we've been studying. So I recommend you get it if you are looking for some good reading material. It's The Lawyer and the Mystic. Anyway, yeah, but the basic idea is that our souls come back to earth, or dimensions of our soul. Not you can't know of an earlier life. Also discussed in, there's a book by Rabbi Dov Ber-Pinson called Reincarnation in Judaism. It's a very dense book, but he basically proves, based on the teachings of Kabbalah, that we can't really know of ourselves in an earlier life. There's certain facets of our earlier soul that will come back, and we will keep on coming back. The various different facets will keep coming back until our soul will, every dimension of the soul fulfills its purpose, and then the soul collectively has its final experience in the world to come. But the idea being is that each of our souls has a journey to accomplish. The end game, this is an important talk about from a Chabad philosophy standpoint. The end game is not the Garden of Eden. That's not the end game. That's a temporary end game. The end game is the Messianic era. That's the ultimate. And as we've been discussing and emphasizing right here, is that the Garden of Eden is also divine revelation. It's not divine essence. So it's divine revelation absent the human consciousness, but it's still divine revelation. So you would say there's God's essence, there's divine revelation absence human consciousness, and then there's human consciousness. Our ability to choose only exists within our human consciousness. So, emphasizing the point, when it says, and you shall know today, it means today, while our souls are in our bodies, that's when we are instructed to know. That's when we are instructed to put this effort into believing in this higher dimension and doing what we can to get to that place of knowledge. By the way, this is not like mystical stuff. What I mean by that is this is our work. Like, why does a person choose to do, when you're facing a real struggle, why do you choose good over evil? You don't choose it because you know. You know that on lower levels, smaller challenges, right? Just parenthetical. There's a book called Gates of Trust, and it was written by Rabbeinu Bachai, and lived in the in the 11th century, and he has it's kind of a cute take on trusting God, right? He's talking about layers of trust in God. Sometimes we trust in God because we see that it works. So you see, every time I found a challenge and I trusted in God, it worked out for me. So odds are that trusting in God works. So am I trusting in God, or am I trusting in the results that I have proof that it works, right? So that's a level of knowing God, right? I see God's hand, that every time I face these challenges and I trust in God and I surrender to that, it works out. So I know God is here. That's not very profound, but it's good. It's a good starting point. It's when you face challenge that you don't have experience with, you don't have knowledge of, and you choose to trust in God in those moments. That's when you're accessing the transcendent dimension of faith and making it real for yourself. That's really the main point he's making here. I'll say that again, maybe in different words. The concept of surrender. I'll use the AA analogy again, because it speaks to me. People who are, active in addiction and want to enter into recovery, the first step is an act of surrender. Actually, it's actually really the second step. The first step is that came to see my life became unmanageable. I forget exactly how the language goes, right? My life's out of control. Okay, I want to change it. So the second step is came to believe that a power higher than me could restore me to sanity or something like that. That's an act of surrender. And the analogy that I came up with when I was teaching classes on the 12 steps was, imagine you, I don't know how you got there, but you're hanging on a cliff, okay? And you're holding on for dear life, and the stuff is starting to crumble. And somebody says to you, let go. God's going to catch you. And you say, but all I see is, a long fall. And he says, just trust me. You got to let go. And you don't want to let go. Why? Because even though the dirt is crumbling in your hands, at least it's something you're holding on to. You're still holding on to your ego. You're still holding on to the consciousness of self. And when you let go, that's the act of surrender. When we face challenge, when you're holding on to the cliff and it's solid, right? You're still believing in yourself in some way. You're still believing in your own power to some extent. When the earth is crumbling, you begin to wonder, maybe there's something bigger. And when you let go, you've demonstrated a surrender to something that's beyond your comprehension. So, and by the way, this is true for each person in their own experience. In other words, there's no one and done. Everybody's got their challenges. Everybody has their level of knowledge of God. And in each of our life's experiences, as we grow in that connection, the level of knowing becomes more, and the level of faith, the bar is raised, which then requires that the level of surrender be greater. Our job, our work is to know today while we are in a body, to know, to demonstrate in our actions, knowing the higher dimension, not knowing it that we actually know it, but knowing it because we're going to demonstrate in our actions that even though it doesn't make sense to me, I totally cannot comprehend it, but I'm going to do what God wants because that's what is asked of me. What we're basically saying is that the higher dimension of God, the transcendent dimension of God, is becoming real for me.
Why does it sound like to me like God, I said like God's got my back so I can stop striving or trying to cling on things? Right.
I think that means, well, I would say two things. First of all, I think that concept is on one level, it's misrepresented. But on a higher level, this is what we were speaking about before, is that you don't have to fight so much when you know God, when you feel close to God, or your faith is strong. you maintain much greater equilibrium because you're able to look at what's in front of you and say, okay, this is a challenge. I'm going to go with it. This is God speaking to me, right? If we're able to bring ourselves to a place of faith, to know that when I face challenge, it's God speaking to me, I am able to flow more easily.
So like I see that if I practice that and I have like multiple surrenders, even tens of surrenders each day, just know that God's there for me. So if I go through that phase, then ultimately I wouldn't have to. I would just be in a constant state of surrender.
Yeah, that's a little bit idealistic and utopian because we have a body and we're going to wake up and we're going to struggle. But we can get good at it. Not at the struggle. We can get good at the surrender.
Yes, because part of it is the striving need to feel like you're in control. There's moments when you have control and moments when you don't. And what do you do with those moments where you feel like you don't have control? And that's where surrender can be empowering. You can release this energy and allow something else to take over, maybe fill that space until it's time for you to re-engage. Try to be in it.
Yeah. I think this is the point I was making about trust before. If you trust and you see a result, it becomes easier to trust. That's not divorced from knowing God. But the more you practice this, because what you're doing every time you engage in surrender, you're putting your soul first. You're calming the ego. I started mentioning this point before, but I didn't finish it, is if somebody challenges you, something about your character, you offended me, you did this, you did that, or you're being really honest with yourself without any of the shame, you'd be able to be an open book. The shame comes from the ego. And every time we let the ego get involved, we resist. We're always going to have an ego. But the more we surrender our ego, the easier it is to surrender the ego. Which is why the more we study Torah, the more we pray, the more we do mitzvahs, the more refined we become, meaning the more the ego recognizes the truth of God within ourselves and within the world around us.
So, kind of getting the sense that this would also be related to the giving of tzedakah, even if you don't really, at that time, make the pledge to give whatever it is. That you would increase your knowledge of God by actually giving the money.
Why? You're correct, but why? Well, because what happens when we give, when it's difficult and we give beyond our capacity, we are stilling the ego. The Alter Rebbe in a letter in the book of Tanya says the following, that when I have money, I've earned the money. Meaning there's probably, other than our spouses and our children, and sometimes even them, the next closest thing to us is our money. Why? Because I've earned it. So I actually put myself into the work that I've now earned this money. Additionally, I can use this money to buy things for myself, whether they're my basic life necessities or even the pleasures. So if I'm taking something that's so connected to who I am and I'm giving it away, I'm basically calming my ego. I'm refining my ego. And when we do that, we open ourselves up. What does it mean we open ourselves up? We're accessing a part of ourselves that's not limited. It's not finite within the body. It's something bigger than us. And that opens up ourselves to whatever God has in store. And it opens up in a reciprocal manner that God opens up to us. It's the dancing, putting the music on and dancing. It's the smiling. It's engaging in a selfless act. It's doing something that's not comfortable for us. All of these things are different ways of tweaking the ego to be a little bit more refined. And it's an automatic process. When the ego is less prominent, less dominant, the soul comes out. And the more the soul comes out, the easier it is to have faith. So when we say, if you want to connect with that higher dimension of God, it's through Torah study, through doing the mitzvahs, it's through prayer. It's not a mystical thing. It's a very practical thing. The more you get to know God, the more you do what God wants, the more I think about God, the less in all of these instances I'm thinking about myself and my interest. And therefore, the result of that naturally is that the soul is more exposed. And if the soul is more exposed, I'm more plugged in, I'm more connected. And then things flow from there.
You think, let's Job.
Say again?
You think, let's Job, right? So the Job story, this is like all of that.
Yeah, so faith, the Job story is a story of faith, right? And again, that's back to the challenge question. We should never be challenged like Job, but challenge is designed to push us to the next level. Just like in the story of Job, that's what the Satan told God is, you think he really believes in you? You think he's just doing this because things are working out for him? And so, well, let's see how it works out when things are not working out for him. So we should never be challenged. But that's what challenge is. It's pushing us to the next level. Why is something challenging to us? Because we're not sure that we can actually do it. If you're pressing 100 pounds, 50 is no big deal for you. But if you're not pressing 50 pounds, 50 is very difficult. But you get better at it. You become stronger. You're able to do more. And each of us has our own life journey for what challenges, what's the destination for each of us. My destination is not your destination. Your destination is not my destination. Each of us have a different destination, and we've been given all the tools and all the circumstances in order to achieve our destination.
I think the charity giving has been one of those things that guys been working with me on, like more recently. You know, as I've been studying more, and actually I just bought a book by David Prager. Really great book. And one of the things that I had to realize was, like, in order to live a more abundant life, you have to activate the principle too. And that's something that I never really understood. It was more like, okay, if I keep more, then I have more. But actually we don't, right? And so, you have I had to realize that giving is more a mindset of abundance than trying to hold on to stuff.
Beautiful.
And so that's something that, I've been telling my sister who's struggling financially. I'm like, there was a time when I just consumed, and like whatever I had, I just used it for ego, more myself. And then I had to realize, like, no, actually, in order to activate on the spiritual principle and truly be abundant, you gotta give, bro.
Yeah.
And actually, it's one way for you to be more God-like, right? And that not giving is an example of a mindset that knows lack.
Yeah,
Scarcity.
yeah.
Yeah.
Live expansively, and then you live expansively. It's direct. No, it's the direct result. Yes.
In the context of the teachings of the Torah, is there a significant difference between sacrifice and surrender? Or are they two sides of the same coin?
It's an interesting question. I'm saying this without authority. I think sacrifice to me, to the conversation we had before, Ariella, that I think sacrifice is in the battle. And I think surrender transcends the battle. So that's how those words speak to me, right? So if I'm sacrificing, that means I'm engaged in what is it that I'm giving up? And surrender is I'm not giving anything up. I'm giving myself. I'm giving the whole of who I am to God, to the mission, to purpose. Which, by the way, is the truth, right? Whatever negativity I have doesn't have to be discarded. It has to be channeled. It has to be harnessed. Because it's a power. But if I'm engaged in the negativity around it, then I'm struggling with it. I'm sacrificing that part of me. And you don't have to sacrifice any part of you in the service of God. But if you're going to surrender, you bring the totality of who you are into that relationship.
So the sacrifice could be it's something in the process of surrender. And just Cain and Abel talking, the idea that Abel's sacrifices were greater and true, and therefore he was rewarded in life, not necessarily directly by God, but rewarded in life. Cain being jealous of that, holding on to the ego, gave in to the ego part of him. So, but his sacrifices were paltry thing.
Yeah.
Made me think of that. Maybe sacrifice is just an indicator of surrender, but it's also a lesson of giving up something that may hurt in the short term, but in the long term is far better person.
Yeah. All right. Everybody have a great week.